empty apartments and houses. Empty apartments and houses. It's almost the same number as the housing deficit. So we have at the same time deficit and surplus. Empty apartments and houses. So this paradox must be taken into account because we are not talking about our capacity of building spaces. It's not a matter of, it's not a subject to construction companies. It's a subject to access to land and access to housing and who have access to housing and land and who not. And the third issue here that I want to phrase is that the model, apart of excluding the poor for having access to infrastructure, to well-located land, and to the opportunities the city concentrate, job opportunities, economic opportunities, cultural opportunities, also is a model of depletion of natural resources, because most of the self-produced habitat of the people is produced on very, very bad land in the sense of a land that is not suited to urbanize, like river fringe, high slopes, peripheries, very far away from the city, situations that you could not or should not urbanize, and it is urbanized. So this is more or less how is the image of our pattern. We have at the same time a huge amount of money invested into cities and the majority of population. This is an image of the neighborhood of Morumbi in São Paulo, the capital of the metropolitan region. If we take the Human Development Index in Brazil, and which is below, the red zones are the ones who are below 0.650, and the blue ones are the good ones, the better ones in terms of the Human Development Index. You can see very clearly that the northeastern part of Brazil, the northern part of Brazil, the Amazon, are the poorest part of Brazil. But this is a question of scale, because if you take the same index inside the metropolitan regions, like Rio, this is the metropolitan region of Rio de Janeiro, you're going to see red zones in the periphery of Rio de Janeiro. If you see Rio de Janeiro, there is in the blue area, is a blue spot there. But if you go inside Rio, the metropolitan region, you're going to see red zones with a Human Development Index of poverty line or below poverty lines in the periphery of Rio de Janeiro. The exact same thing in Curitiba. Yeah, you have heard about the wonderful urban strategies success of Curitiba. Where are all the poor in Curitiba, in the peripheries, in the exact same conditions that you have in Rio de Janeiro or São Paulo. In the periphery, living very badly, very far away from the amenities Curitiba was known of making available for the cities, but not available for all, available for some of the dwellers. Most of them are in the outskirts, and you have in one side the metropolitan region of Curitiba, or the municipalities, and the other side the capital, Curitiba itself, where you have the city center better off, and as you go to the periphery, you see. And the same thing in São Paulo, the capital of capital in Brazil. The capital of money is not the political capital, but is the financial capital of Brazil. where you have conditions and poverty exactly the same as you have in the Northeast, in the periphery of São Paulo. So what you have here, and let me go back to this table now, is if you take the case, this is the percentage of poor people in 2003, state compared to the metropolitan region. So if you take São Paulo, 20% of the population of the state of São Paulo is poor. 24.7% of the metropolitan region of São Paulo is poor. So it's bigger than the state. Of course, compared to the Northeast, where the average is 58% poor, is less. But at the same time, if you take, even in a case, in a Northeastern case, Pernambuco, state of Pernambuco, the state poverty percentage is almost 60. The metropolitan region of Recife is even greater. Same in Curitiba. The state has 24.4, the metropolitan region almost 25%, which means basically that poverty is urban and metropolitan, period, now. That it's not rural, it's not in the hinterland. And poverty is concentrated, not only poverty, but also harsh conditions, slum conditions, is concentrated in the points where economic growth is great and not declining. So you have at the same time where you have economic growth, you have the multiplication of slums and lack of infrastructure, and not the contrary, and not the opposite. And this raises one question, and I'm trying to dialogue with the panel of this morning, one question, which is the relationship between macroeconomic policies and urban policies, and the changes we need to see in this field. Because, of course, if you have an economic policy targeting growth, increase of jobs, and economic growth, that doesn't mean necessarily that you're going to have a better living conditions in the cities. And I can tell you, it's exactly the opposite. In the cities, they are booming in terms of more jobs, more economic growth, increases in their economic power are exactly the places where we have the explosion of slums. You're going to say, wow, it's because migration goes to where economic opportunities are, of course. But at the same time, the other issue here is concentration of wealth and power. So this means that economic growth in Brazil and in most Latin American countries comes together with continuous concentration of wealth and power. So keep all the poor apart from benefiting of this economic growth. And the relationship, as Mila Freire pointed out in this morning, is land. Land prices, land market, real estate appreciation. All the investment that goes into the city channeled into real estate appreciation. And as land becomes more and more expensive, becomes much more difficult for poor people, even with jobs and salaries, to get access to land and houses, well-located land and houses. So the result is that we have an average of 12 million households in irregular settlements, and with inappropriate access to infrastructure, it's almost 25% of all Brazilian households today. What happened with urban policies? in order to face these issues. In the 80s and in the 90s, we had the fiscal crisis, reduced investment in sanitation and housing. Our National Housing Bank was closed down in 86. So the mantra by that time was cut public expenditure, no more public debt. It's impossible to invest with public money to promote better infrastructure to the poor. So that simply dropped dramatically the degree of investment in urban infrastructure, environmental sanitation, housing, and urban transportation as true big sectors that had a very, very dropping rate of investment during the 80s and 90s. But also we had a very erratic institutionalization of central government urban policies. Housing and environmental sanitation and urban transportation, they shift from one minister to other minister, closing down and opening again new offices. So we had no urban policy, steady urban policy during this period. But also it was a period of decentralization. So the second mantra was cities must face by themselves. It's impossible to have a central government taking care of all that. So also the idea was to decentralize to the cities the power to do that. In the exact same moment where there were no public financing or investment available. So cities, you can imagine, were very, very bad off in trying to do something about the issues they had to face. And what we had by that time was a clientelistic response to the demand, because the demand on local government was very, very important. We were talking about the democratic period, free elections, direct elections for mayor, governors, redemocratization of Brazil. So it was a big pressure from social movements, slum dwellers, neighborhood association, claiming for inclusion and citizenship in the city. So governments had to face that in one way or another. So investment in urban infrastructure, especially in slum upgrading, or not exactly slum upgrading, but popular neighborhoods upgrading, as generally, not necessarily in slums, but in popular parceling of land, Congress and political party became brokers between individual urban demands and public resources. So given the scarcity of resources and the pressure for resources from the communities, investment in neighborhood upgrading or slum upgrading became the most important bargain issue for electoral performance in Brazil. Of course, you have 70%, 60%, 50% of the population without the right for full citizenship. But then, so that means that nobody, in principle, since everybody is irregular, illegal, informal, nobody has the immediate right to be part of the city. So this right is negotiated through vote. So a machinery of, and it's very important to understand that political machinery, because that political machinery is the same machinery that prevent the change of the model, of the exclusionary model, because it's very, in terms of political results, it's perfect. You can maintain a base eternally for 30, 40 years because each election you can invest in one election a little sip of water, the next one a school, the other one a investment in paved streets, and then you can be on and on and on in a relationship of favor between you, the governor, that you make visible a community that in principle is invisible in terms of belonging to the city. So this is the main political force that prevents the exclusionary model to change and to be more responsive rather than going ahead the urbanization all the time, what is going on. So urbanization without full citizenship, it's not by chance that all the efforts that we have been doing on urbanization, on slum upgrading, is never full upgrading. Full of upgrading should be, full urbanization or full regularization should be not only infrastructure, environmental conditions, but also administrative and patrimonial property. That means full legalization. So we never achieve the full legalization. It's always a little bit of this and a little bit of that. And that ambiguity leads to vulnerability, to clientelism. Planning and land policy. Planning and land policy has been a very important part of the territorial exclusion machinery and not the opposite. Because planning, regulation, and land use control dialogue only with middle-class formal markets and their logic and their economic, cultural, and spatial order and logic. And this has a total inability to break with the permanent expansion of peripheries and occupation of environmental fragile areas. And planning is one of the most planning regulation is one of the most important tools to maintain income and opportunities concentrated, preventing poor to have access to allocated land, and maintaining real estate appreciation of invested with infrastructure land over time. So all of this started to change conceptually, but also as a urban policy. In the 80s, under the context of the redemocratization of the country, a movement for urban reform, a coalition of irregular settlers, neighborhood association, architects, engineers, scholars, and urban landless movement started a movement for urban reform, setting up an urban reform agenda. What was the content of urban reform agenda? 1, recognition of housing and land rights. Full recognition, definitive recognition of housing, of land rights of those who were occupying land. 2, struggle against urban land speculation. It was formulated like that, but it's rather, now we see that it's much more struggle against the paradox of having so much empty land and apartment and at the same time such a scarcity. And democratic management of the city. Democratic management of the city is crucial because poor people are away or apart from the city because poor people are a part of the decision-making process of the city, of the regulation. The regulations are decided by few. And so the idea of democratic management, dialoguing also with the panel of this morning, is not a matter of discussing a project of the local level, but taking a part in the decision-making process of where and how and to invest and who's going to pay the bill to do what. That is the process of decision-making. So we have the Federal Constitution of 88. We had a urban policy chapter, and the urban policy chapter, for the first time in Brazil, said a declaration of the social function of the city and urban property, recognized the right to housing and recognition of tenure, and required municipal master plans to enforce the social function of the city. And in 2001, in order to do the way the Constitution would be enforced, a new federal law was established, which is the Statute of the City, establishing a new urbanistic order. And the Statute of the City had basically principles, but also new land management tools, new democratic management instruments, and new land tenure regularization instruments. In 2003, the Ministry of Cities was created with 4 secretaries. I go over there very quickly. And in order to establish a new policy, new urban policy for the country, the decision of the ministry was to call for a national conference involving all the municipalities and all the stakeholders in the internal decision-making process of the ministry. So the process of national conferences of the city evolved more than 3,000 municipalities that elected delegated to state conferences, and the state conference to the national conference, and this national conference elected a national, this is an image of the conferences, elected a national council for the cities that established the main urban policies based on the right to the city, social function of the city, and democratic management and social control over the city, the idea of territorial inclusion and sustainability. I don't have time to develop all the council and its composition. Let me go down there. And just in order to enforce the statute of the city, every city required to have a master plan. And inside this master plan, each master plan had the mission to define the social function of each part of the city. And it should be done in a participatory way throughout the country. So almost 1,700 municipalities had to have their master plans up until 2006. That was established by the law. And the Ministry of Cities provided support to municipalities to do that. Financial support, funding, more than 600 plans, funding scholarships for more than 50 university teams for technical assistance to municipalities, technical support and capacity building for more than 20,000 people. And then after that, we had more than 20,000 people in our training classes, and the results of the campaign, the national campaign for master plans according to the statute of the city, we had almost 93% of all the municipalities that had to approve a master plan did so. And among them, 63% is approved already by the city council. So we had more than 1,500 process of discussing a social function of the city in every part in Brazil. And some of the instruments that were included in those master plans were what we call the special social interest zones into the zoning laws of all the municipalities, which is places and land that is defined as a place to poor people to live and build, both areas of existing communities in slum urbanized areas, but also empty land, well-located land that now is defined as being a place and opening access to the poor in well-located land. So I think this is very important. Just to finish my presentation with that, it's because slum upgrading gets into the international agenda easily now. Everybody agrees with the idea that we have to do in situ urbanization, and that works. But I ask you, we're going to be forever in the next 20, 30, 40 years doing slum upgrading and destroying the cities and the lives of everybody that lives there? So we have to have a preventive approach. And the preventive approach, there is just one phrase that had to do with the preventive approach. That means open access to urbanized land to the poor. So that means clearly intervention in land markets. Otherwise, we're going to be forever doing slum upgrading or investing in beautiful projects, but also just for few people. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think, Mohamed, because of the time constraint, if you would continue, and we'll have questions for both of them at the end, and then a very short wrap-up session.
I was a bit scared when I saw the final program and noted that I was the last speaker, because there is usually a double jeopardy of a catch-22 type when you're a last speaker. On the one hand, you may have nobody listening to you, especially when it is after lunch. But if the people are very kind, as you have been, you may have nothing to say, because everything has been said already. Fortunately, I do have a bit of ideas to share with you, with reference to the title that I was asked to speak about, which is The Urban Face of Poverty, Innovation and New Approaches. And like Jessica, working in a UN organization, I had to put this disclaimer. These are reflections of a UN Habitat staff. Although I have used most of the material that is in the custody of the agency. Urban poverty is a subject that has attracted a lot of attention in the past 3 decades. Richard Stren was the coordinator of the Global Urban Research Initiative more than 10 years ago, did undertake as part of the work a review of work that was done with respect to the subject of urban poverty. And in there, it was more than 400 pieces of literature, reports, research working notes. But the emphasis at that time was more or less on the issue of informalism and marginality, with a view to understanding the implications for management, environment, and urban development as a whole. The issue of urban poverty, as it has been indicated, is one that has been addressed by a number of global summits, from 1972 to the latest Millennium Summit in 2005, whereby even a specific paragraph, 69H, was incorporated addressing issues of urban poverty. So it has been a very topical issue in that respect. Now, with reference to the issue of the face of urban poverty, I found the idea to be very profound, the image of a face of poverty. But then I was wondering, is it an urban face, suggesting a singular dimension of a face, which is both a uniform and a form and essence? Is there one face of poverty? Or are there many faces of urban poverty? In that respect, that there are, in different contexts, you find different phases of poverty. Or even there is a multidimensionality with regard to the face of poverty. in the end, I was even wondering, can we talk of a face or faces? Or like a face has a nose, and eyes, a mouth, and in the end, that constitutes the personality of the face. Can we also talk of the composition of the face of urban poverty or faces of urban poverty, whatever it is? Those are the issues that I was trying to grapple with in terms of this image of urban poverty. And I've been assisted, I think, since early this morning when we started, a number of references were made to the issue of the face of urban poverty. Now, the manifestations of urban poverty itself, how it demonstrates itself and impacts and reveals itself, and the challenges that have been manifest in coping with poverty, and the experience of intervening in either ameliorating urban poverty, alleviating, eradicating it, underscores the fact that there are a number of several elements that are often associated with urban poverty, and which tend to have a very serious bearing on the well-being of those who are trapped in urban poverty. Now, these several elements of urban poverty, the way they impact to the victim in this case, the impact can be cumulative, that all those elements can exert their impact synchronously at the same time, or they can be separately simultaneous. One element impacts on you, and then another one picks up at the same time. So I thought in our discussion of the face of urban poverty, it may be useful to understand those elements. And in the end, I think this will also help us in defining strategies for coping with urban poverty once we understand the elements. And perhaps if we had time to look at how those elements, for the lack of a better word, interact and exert their impact to the victim or to the person who is trapped into urban poverty. The sort of elements I'm referring to, which have been also already referred to since this morning, include the income aspects, the income deficit. There is a particular computation that has been made in terms of what level of income satisfies a certain level of well-being of a human person. And oftentimes this is the reference. In the morning you did hear Mila refer to the $1, the $2 notion, and its annual implications. This is a synthesis. It's an aggregated indicator of various aspects of a human well-being, and then it's synthesized into an income category such as a $1 a day, as it is. But I was also suggesting that together with that, we may need to look at issues such as deprivation. You can have the $1, but you can be deprived of certain essentials that are key, critical for your well-being. There is also the aspect of exclusion and alienation. And I'm using very broad categories here because of the shortage of time, that you may be just excluded in a number of dimensions I shall try to address later on. And then there are aspects of vulnerabilities and insecurity, which manifest themselves also as part of urban poverty. You can be vulnerable to, natural, including diseases, including earthquakes, including the environment that you live in. You can also be insecure. You can have no access to certain spheres that are key to your life, including, in this case, the insecurity refers to the safety aspects of violence. There are some sections of a societal population that are under constant threat because of the circumstances in which they find themselves. And an additional component of poverty that I thought needs to be addressed when we want to understand the face of urban poverty is the inequity. That's the relative access that you get to whatever your society can offer in that respect, whether it is water, whether it's space to reproduce your well-being in this case. So the inequity need also be a component of understanding urban poverty. Now, in terms of income poverty, I don't want to dwell on it because Mila has given you figures earlier on that indeed the absolute number of the urban poor has increased in the last 15 to 20 years. The figures vary. I saw Mila referring to a figure of 29 million. I wasn't sure whether that was a typographical error or it is the actual figure of those who live below, with less than $2 globally. I'm referring here to the $1 only. Between 1998 and 2000, the number is, absolute number is increased from 330 million to 495. If you're using the income deficit component, it's only less than 500 million people in that absolute poverty that we are referring to. And as I said earlier on, this indicator is just an integrated indicator for livelihood, consumption, and the overall ability to cope. However, I think as it has been indicated in various other forums, this element of designating poverty has limited precision, particularly in situations where you have non-recorded transactions, non-market transactions. People in the, those who work on gender studies often tend to say when a woman goes to collect water in rural Africa, that's not monetized, it's not quantified, and it's not part of the overall expenditure of a society. So even the gender dimensions of such a variable is not very helpful as it is. And then it doesn't also capture the total dynamic of livelihood access, social reproduction, and the settings. It has concentrated so much on these transactional aspects of purchasing within a monetized cash economy. One doesn't look at then what happens to the actual livelihood, the way in which the total deficit is covered. What kind of systems and backups exist in a society. And how do these people then relate to themselves in terms of deploying their social capital? So it is an important variable, but it doesn't really help us very much in understanding or getting the full picture of the face of urban poverty in these kind of situations. It is in this respect that I was suggesting that we need to look at the aspect of deprivation. And I just very crudely here, I was referring to deprivation as the extent to which access to basic need is limited and the enjoyment of full rights of citizenship is constrained. I'm becoming politically sensitive here, not only to look at deprivation in physical terms, but also being deprived of accessing your whole gamut of citizenship rights in your society. And here, citizenship rights range from decision-making to fostering accountability and transparency among those who are leading you or among those who are representing you. There are sections of the society that are deprived in that respect. And key among these, as I said, among those basic needs that may constitute, may often be associated with deprivation, include housing, water and sanitation, infrastructure, means of livelihood, security, and I put under quotes, actually the other quote is missing, participation. Participation here, I'm taking it through the whole policy cycle from decision-making to monitoring, evaluation, and ensuring that you are participating in the determination of the destiny of your society in that respect. Now, all that point was ultimately leading to the notion of slums. As you know, I'm coming from UN Habitat. And I'm suggesting here, through these series of bullets, that the notion of slums actually encapsulates that multidimensionality of the face of poverty. And in this respect, just for purposes of this discourse, the notion of slum here is referring to a living environment in which there is poor access to improved water, poor access to improved sanitation, insufficient living area, overcrowding. Sometimes in our figures, we take any room of 10 by 10, 10 feet by 10, which has more than 3 people, is overcrowded. The housing condition, the low durability of housing, and the insecurity of tenure, whether you are a homeowner or a tenant. When there is insecurity in terms of your living environment, now, in the end, the criticism often leveled on this definition of slum is, when you don't have water in a building in Washington can you simply designate it as a slum? A number of living areas in developing countries don't have water, but they have all the other variables. So it's sort of a combination. You can have 2 or 3 or more of these conditions to constitute a slum. In that respect, what we are seeing together with slum is there has been this process of urbanization of poverty. Poverty has become an urban phenomenon. In the morning, I think reference was made that the living conditions, particularly within the context of slums, is such that, in fact, the rural dwellers seems to fare better than the circumstances among the population that live in slums. And secondly, there is more feminization of poverty. Women fare far worse in the context of urban poverty than men in this case. There is this dual process that is becoming more evident in the last 3 decades in developing countries: urbanization of poverty and the feminization of urban poverty. This is a face. This is an image of a slum in Africa, as you can see it. There are now 1 billion slum dwellers globally. This was 2005. And this is the general tendency, in a number of human slum settlements in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. This is the nature of the environment they live in, and overcrowding, disease, poor sanitation, poor garbage. The roofing here just demonstrates the density of this living. I mean, in between those units, there are all sorts of things there. There are pathways, bicycles go through there, pedestrians walk through them, as it can be seen here. This is the road network within this neighborhood. That is supposed to be a garbage dump, but it's part of the environment of the settlement in a Nairobi, actually, context. This is a typical dwelling of a slum. The building on the left here, this is a building, by the way. This is a place where somebody lives. And that's the building material. And the roofing structure as can be seen there. This is the full picture of that dwelling. And that's the door of this particular person. That is the sanitation facility. That gentleman is in a sanitary facility there, as it is in between houses. Overcrowding, externally and internally. This is a place where livelihood is generated. The gentleman there is working on an equipment to gain a livelihood. Now, what is the process? In terms of the demographic development in the last 200 years, this graph was, let me just go back. Oh, sorry. That is a rural population as it was growing between 1850, say, to the period between 2000 and projected to 2015. There is the urban population, as you can see, between 2000 and 2050, the projection is we are being increasingly urbanizing. And that's the slum population as it stands. The MDGs, the Millennium Declaration, indicates that at least by 2020 we need to get somewhere with respect to improving the condition of slums. But, of course, that 2020 has to be seen within the projection of the development of human settlements during that period. This is just another figure that is just concentrated between 2000 and 2020 to give you a fairer picture. Now, that is the dynamic then, when you look at it with reference to what is the demographic growth in terms of the brown, the gray one is the rural population. The red is the urban slum population. And the brown is the other, the better part of the urban population. the Millennium Declaration, the MDGs were targeting 100 million slum dwellers, which is this little component here, within the context of the 1 billion slum dwellers that currently exist. But by 2050, these 100 million slum dwellers that we will have, hopefully, have impacted. And it can easily be done in China. China can easily swap out the 100 million slum dwellers by 2015. But looked at within the broader context of the development of slum, that is a very minuscule amount as it is. Now, the other components, as I indicated, of urban poverty are constituted of exclusion and alienation, vulnerability, insecurity, and inequity. And this is just a satellite image just showing you the location of one of the largest slum settlements in Nairobi, Kibera. And it's situated in between a river, which is almost dead, and a very poshy, high-class area. So these slum dwellers are rather very insecure with the expansion of that high-value land. And on the other side, there is this river here. Now, what are the elements that characterize this insecurity? As I pointed out earlier on, insecurity, exclusion, first of all, and alienation is indicated by the denial of effective civic engagement and fostering accountability. Most of these slum dwellers, the urban poor, do not have effective means of participating in the political processes in a meaningful way. Oftentimes they're just used and abused as, during election time. They become the goons who support the various political leaders. And they do not have a means of fostering accountability among those people who are expected to represent them, who get into leadership position. I have been one of the idealists for quite some time, celebrating the intense social capital among the urban poor. The place I come from that background of urban poverty, and I've always praised and felt confident in the social capital that has developed among my community. But in the end, when you look at it critically, that social capital is only an internal social capital. It's a bonding social capital. It just bonds my relationship with the fellow poor. It's not a social capital that enables us to bridge with the other social groups, or even to link us up with the existing systems, whether it is service system or political system. So the tendency is oftentimes that we survive, or the poor in this case, not we, the poor survive through the social capital which is internal, which is bonding, oftentimes which tends to be very, very weak because it erodes very fast and it cannot cope with the shocks. That additional dimension of poverty also suggests a low capacity to cope with economic and social shocks as well as diseases. These people, their incomes are very irregular. Oftentimes they fall into debt. Their employment is insecure. They are fired for much of the year. And when they fall sick, they have no way of getting redress in any way. And indeed, they are also prone to natural and human trigger disasters. They live in that inhospitable environment, which is subjected often to fires, to landslides, as it is. So, and it is unsafe. Most of the slum areas are no-go zones for all of us in this room. Oftentimes, either they'll take off our jackets and our cameras and our glasses, and they are often stigmatized in that regard. But I thought perhaps traveling all the way from Africa to come to America, I should not dwell on just castigating urban poverty and the people who live in there. Perhaps it's important also to understand, to acknowledge the potential which exists among these communities. Indeed, they do have a high level of creativity. There are also robust survival mechanisms which have sustained them for much of this difficult period. And a la DeSoto, they do have that reservoir of dead capital. Indeed, most of their assets that are accumulated, the building constructions and the products they produce, if there was a means of integrating them and putting them in the register of the national assets, it is quite a valuable body of capital. And as I said, they are also a formidable political force, which is often used and abused. Now, the title did ask us, what are the, after taking this overview of urban poverty and its multidimensional character, what are the new approaches and innovations that are emerging? And I'm trying to suggest that the governance paradigm, which has now been accepted in the last decade and a half, arises partly because of that recognition that in the end, cities are not determined by single actors. It's not the state only. It's not the mayor of a city that determines the destiny of a city. Rather, there are various sectors within the societal life of a city that contribute to the determination of its destiny. There is the public sector, the private sector, the civil society sector. Now, it is this linkage which within the governance framework, recognizing the various locations, positions, power relations, that has become a prominent paradigm now in understanding the process of urban development and modalities of overcoming the constraints and challenges that are encountered by urban dwellers. I want to argue that this is an important approach, which has influenced most of the thinking and interventions among development agencies. Secondly, there is also more attention is being given to the local level now. Since this morning, reference has been made to municipalities, local government. But in terms of analytical insights, operational designs, more attention is given to the city and to the local, to the municipal level in that respect. Here I was just drawing up a diagram which we use in UN Habitat, which just illustrates the implications of the governance paradigm, which brings together the public sector, the private sector, and the civil society, and the sort of tools that have emerged, at least within our shop, that operates within that, from municipal front offices to the urban governance index, which measures the state of governance, local governance in a particular area. This whole is an illustration of some of the innovations that are emerging out of understanding the multidimensionality of poverty and the multiplicities of actors who determine the destiny of city and who are key actors in the development processes. I have just borrowed this slide from a colleague who I was with 2 weeks ago in Paris, César, who was just sharing with us their experience of participatory budgeting, which is another innovative tool that has emerged in terms of a new approach of addressing the issue of urban poverty. The striking aspect of this image, without getting into its detail, it has converted the whole notion of government and governance. As you can see, society is at the top. Oftentimes we put the mayor or the governor or the director, but it is a society which is at the top. And all the others are called support activities in that respect. So there is a paradigmatic shift in us using this governance paradigm and understanding more rigorously the notion of governance. And some of these new approaches now that have emerged include participatory budgeting, which our Latin American colleagues have quite excelled, and now it is spreading all over. In terms of our own work, there are new land tenure systems that are being considered. We have a global land tool network, and it is looking at ways in which you can sort out the land problems among the poor, including collective sharing, collective ownership of land, and designating ownership within that collective gamut. A reference was made in the morning about microfinancing schemes, from the Grameen's Bank and other entities. A lot of innovative microfinancing mechanisms and processes are emerging. And for us, in the context of UN Habitat, now we have been working for the last 2 years to see if we can have a proper financing facility that can be accessible, at various levels to the poor. At the moment, most of these financing institutions do not provide proper access to the poor in this case. So we need a global facility that addresses this. Then there is the notion of cities as engines of economic growth. is a new debate. I was just reading an article. Michael Cohen is pushing, promoting this logic that we should not simply talk in a very philanthropic, consumptionist mode of underscoring the importance of urban simply because there is poverty, and poverty means dealing with slums. But we have to look at the city in a more rigorous way. The city has a productive capacity in that respect, and to see what kind of interventions that we need to make in city with a view to addressing urban poverty, which harnesses that potential and capacity of the city. Just continuing with the new approaches and innovations, there is the resurgence of spatial planning. For over 10 years, we did our stock taking. The subject of spatial planning was abandoned, neglected in a number of developing countries. But right now, there is a new debate emerging globally on the importance of location and space in terms of enhancing the productive capacity of the city, but also in terms of understanding more how the urban poor fares with respect to transportation, modes of livelihood. And I think my colleague here, the panel, did refer to the notion of the right to the city. The right to the city is a new discourse. It's a new contract that is being promoted in terms of the people and those who are on the other side of governance. It's a contract that wants to underscore that in the final analysis, the whole notion of citizenship is not an abstraction at the level of the state. Citizenship has to reflect itself in the everyday life of the citizen, in the way in which they live, in the way in which they go to work, in the space in which they live. And the most effective space in which citizenship can be exercised is at the local level. It's the city, particularly now that the city is becoming an important crucible for development. I am just finishing, actually, I saw the note coming. The other aspect is how we are dealing with issues of eviction. At the moment, at this stage now, with our understanding of urban poverty, there is now almost a general condemnation of forced eviction. That's why our colleagues in Zimbabwe and various other African countries have become unpopular, because that's not the approach to sort out the land problem, the planning problems. As I said, 2 weeks ago, I was at a meeting which brought together a number of UN agencies to look at the issues of social inclusion, inclusive cities. It is also becoming a prominent agenda in terms of addressing some of our challenges. And donor agencies, UN bodies are now talking of the language of coordination and alignment of development assistance. We in the UN reform, the issue of alignment is key. We are discouraged now from working separately and independently. The conclusion that I wanted to make is just to quote a Kenyan chief executive officer of a development bank who observed, and I think at lunchtime somebody was also reiterating the same point, that currently, in this case, in the context of Kenya, it has been evident that there is effective demand for various concerns of the poor. In this case, it was referring to effective demand for housing. The poor have been shown that they need housing badly, and they can pay for the houses. There is also a high level of liquidity. Most of the financial institutions at the national level and globally, they have lots of money lying out there. And this liquidity can somehow be deployed to address the demand. In a number of African countries, in a number of developing countries, and globally, there is also an effective capacity to produce for most of these needs, including in this respect for housing. So there is demand, there is liquidity, there is a capacity to deliver. One wonders then, why aren't we solving this problem? I just wanted to leave that question at the global level. Thank you.
Thank you so much. These were two excellent presentations. I think we can probably have questions for about 15 minutes, and we'll have a brief wrap-up and try to end at 2:30. I'd like to invite Blair at the end to just, since this is the last CUSP seminar, truly a sad occasion, but so we'll end promptly at 2:30. Yes, in the back.
Thank you. I'm Olga Kaganova of the Urban Institute, and my question is to Professor Rolnik. You mentioned in the end that there are plans now to provide access for the urban poor to well-located vacant land and to have some interventions in the market. The question is, could you tell a couple of words about the concept, how it will be done? Because we know from countries as from Ethiopia to Egypt to Kyrgyzstan that as soon as land is given for free to poor, it immediately ends up being sold, and again the final gain goes not to the poor. So did you discover something better?
Should I answer? Thank you for your question. Give us the opportunity to develop a little bit more what is the idea of these new tools, combining special interest zoning, which is usually zoning regulations are related basically with middle class and high class market. And the difference between cities in the north, Europe, United States, Canada, and cities in the south is that cities in the north, middle class market is basically 70%, 80% of the market. And in the cities in the south, in Brazilian cities, middle class market is 30%. In some cities like Recife or Fortaleza, 20%, 15% of the total market. So when you do zoning and you establish standards that are a cartography of those middle class markets and the way they organize space and the way they organize investment, financial flux of investment over time, ways of organizing space and all that, you just put popular markets aside from those places. For instance, the concept of high density in zoning regulations all over the planning systems in the world. High density means skyscrapers. But skyscrapers is middle class housing. Low income housing is very, very high density, completely horizontal. And that doesn't exist in the concept of high density in zoning. So what we are talking about is establishing zoning laws that define horizontal densities, high horizontal densities in well-located land. Mixed use, both commercial and residential, because most of popular neighborhoods have mixed use. And progressive construction as a rule, not as a illegal practice. The idea that people build one room and then 2 years after a second room and then 10 years after a third room. This can be part of the law and not outlaw. So that means to reform regulations in order to establish that the practice of the popular market is legal and introducing rationality, spatial rationality into that, organization into that, but not out of that. So this is one of the schemes. The scheme is not to give people land for free. No. Expropriating land and then give to the poor. No. Expropriation of land is the most conservative way of giving money to landowners. Expropriation. It doesn't work. It works very, very well to give money to landowners, a lot of money. You have other schemes, like one of the tools that we have in the statute of the city is progressive taxation on empty land, well-located empty land, with all the infrastructure that it's kept underused for years and years and years. So now municipalities have the right to tax progressively. So if you maintain your big piece of land for 3-4 years after the master plan define it as a social special interest zone and give you a time to develop it. You can develop it. You can parcel, sell it. You can build it. Private owned land. If you don't do that, you have to pay the next year 2 times the tax. The following year 3 times, up to 15% of the property value over 5 years. So to do what? To force landowners to sell or to develop that land. So all those are tools to manage with land. And I think we have now very interesting experiences of implementation of those tools. In the metropolitan region of São Paulo, for instance, the city of Diadema and the city of Santo André have done very, very well on imposing this type of new tools and providing more access to land. To what? To housing cooperatives that go there and buy the land. Buy the land and build the houses. And the effect in the market was, first, to go down the price so some more people can buy the land. So I think this is one of the examples of how to do that. And one final comment. Of course, when you do slum upgrading or new housing construction on any intervention with low-income families, there is always, there are going to be always people that are going to sell afterwards this house, and it's going to go to a slum because of the need of the money. But we, professional, middle class, we do the same. We do the same. When we have a house, sometimes we sell our house in order to open a business or in order to move to another city or to change life and to use this as a capital. So I don't see this as a problem. I don't see it as a problem. I think that the problem is if you promote a complete change of the community. So if a real estate developer comes and buy 2, 3, 4, 5 parcels and then develop a shopping center in a place where it was supposed to be a housing neighborhood for low-income families. So I think this can be dealt with regulation. For instance, the prohibition of remembramento, how do you say that? When you buy several lots and parcels and you make one out of them. So this is a way of maintaining the idea of small houses for people that can sell, come and go like everybody. I don't see this as a problem.
Great, thanks. Here and then Richard, and then we may have to wrap up.
Hugh Schwartz, author of a book on Curitiba, and occasional social worker in the slums of Curitiba. I would have a somewhat different presentation, but I'm not going to indicate that. I just wanted to raise a question about certain inconsistencies in the conclusions stated by Professor Rolnik and the data shown. One strong conclusion emphasized 2 or 3 times was the lack of any relationship between new employment opportunities and lower poverty rates. And yet, the data which Professor Rolnik showed indicated that poverty rates were more than twice as high in the Northeast where lower employment opportunities had been offered. And as a matter of fact, were 30 to 50% higher in Porto Alegre than in Curitiba, where there had been less in the way of employment opportunities offered, and in addition, more consistently participatory opportunities offered as was recommended. So there seems to be a lack of agreement between the conclusions and the very data which you are presenting.
Let me make more clear the point I wanted to make. First of all, when you talk about 25% of the population in São Paulo poor, you were talking about 2.5 million people. When you talk about 50% of the population in Recife being poor, you were talking about 1.5 million. So, in absolute numbers, it's a huge concentration of poor people in the best economic performance city. This is one thing. Then second thing, what I was making a point was not, there were 2 points here. One is that poverty is more concentrated in urban and metropolitan rather than in rural. That was one point. A second point, that it's not the same thing, is that you have slum expansion and irregular settlements expansion with economic growth and not without. What happens in São Paulo? People that are living in slums, they are not only those below poverty line. They are those with much better salaries. But the problem is that part of the slum population of São Paulo is of regular workers, formal workers with steady jobs in the market, and not those who doesn't have less than $1 or $2. I'm not talking about that, because the most economic dynamic has the city, the most expensive is the land. So that's the problem. With the same salary, with the same nominal salary in Curitiba or Recife, you live much more better in Recife because it's cheaper. So the most dynamic is the city, economically speaking. The most difficult is for the poor to have access to the good land. So that was the point, not regarded with poverty, but regarded, so you have slums in São Paulo with people with more than 5 minimum wages as family rental income, family income, which is completely different from a city where you can, with this same salary, have a good home. When I'm teaching my students and telling them, one of my students came from a very, very tiny city in the hinterland of São Paulo, and she said, oh yeah, in my city, that is losing population, there is parcels in the city center that are sold for R$1. Of course, nobody wants to live there. It's losing population. You know what I mean? I think it's the relationship, it's not the amount of money that the people has, but it's rather what they can gather as a part of the city with this money, with this income.
One final question, Richard, a quick question and a quick answer.
Okay, I want to thank the two speakers for really good presentations at the end of what's been, at least for me, a very stimulating day, notwithstanding my own comments. I guess my question has to do with the fact that from Raquel we got a exposition of all of the really interesting developments and ideas that are coming out of Brazil. And from Mohamed, we got an exposition of the ideas that are undergirding or keeping the habitat, making the habitat program as interesting and important as it is for many, many different parts of the world, particularly in the area of slum upgrading and governance. Okay, so this whole experience that we've had today has began to as a focus on external assistance and whether external assistance for urbanization was important. It would appear from listening to Raquel that all of that happened really because of the genius and imagination and ability to innovate of Brazilians within their own local context. So my question actually is for Mohamed. I'm putting him on the spot. Is there a sense now, because you've been in Habitat for a while and you've been studying urban for a long time, the kinds of ideas that are coming out of Brazil, the kinds of ideas that are being developed by southern countries, are these becoming more the currency in agencies like Habitat than they were before? And would you like to comment on that?
Is that the last one, or there's?
Yeah, it's the last comment.
Okay. Yeah. One of the challenges that we are addressing right now in the context of a medium-term strategic and institutional plan of UN Habitat for the next 6 years is how is the whole notion of networking and partnership, which is in currency now. How do we link up with knowledge centers? How do we link up with municipal authorities? And how do we harness the global knowledge as it stands? Because for us, living in Nairobi, in one corner of Nairobi, Gigiri, we might not really understand the dynamics of the world. So we need to foster linkages with where action is taking place and the insights and experiences that are emerging from there. So one challenge is to figure out how can we do this effectively. At this point in time, yes, there are a number of interesting insights that are emerging from societies such as the Brazilian one, ranging in this case from participatory budgeting, the issue of right to the city, the issue of social inclusion, the issue of regularization of settlements as it is, as an agenda. You may want to know that we launched our campaign in Brazil a couple of years ago in that respect, the governance campaign, which I'm responsible for. So the point that perhaps can emerge out of our discussion is first, there is a deeper, more rigorous understanding of the phenomenon of urban poverty for institutions such as UN Habitat that is emerging from scholars and researchers. But it is also posing a challenge in terms of what is the direction of urban research that needs to be undertaken now, and what kind of information, data, and knowledge that we need to harness. We are taking up that exercise. One of the major projects that we are undertaking is to understand intra-urban differences. How do we figure out poverty? Because at the moment, at this stage, much of the data that we have is aggregated data. It's national data. Or at times it is city data. We are trying to go into the city and figuring out how are the different components of the city rising. So at the level of knowledge, we have a lot to learn from institutions that are actually out there in the practice. At the level of practice, yes, there are those movements that are emerging, such as right to the city, social inclusion, and others. We are also working with policymakers. I mean, Latin America, we have a ministerial body called MINUVI. And we are working closely with them. And we have established one in Africa, Amchud, as I said, and we have another one in Asia, an Asian Pacific Ministerial Conference. We are also working in policymakers in terms of defining the relevant agenda as it is. The answer is in the affirmative. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Before inviting Blair up to speak, I'd just like to say something very, very briefly. It's been a privilege to be involved with the CUSP program at the Woodrow Wilson Center. Briefly about my background, I span two worlds now. I'm an academic, I teach at Yale, but I'm a practitioner. I was at the United Nations Population Division for 26 years, spent a lot of time working in the field, to more than 100 countries, worked in more than 20 megacities. After that, I took early retirement, came here, spent a year at the Wilson Center, which was truly an extraordinary year. And since then, I've been at Yale, and similar to what Mila Freire talked about, the prejudice toward, emphasis on agriculture, teaching in a school of environmental studies, people's attitude was like, what is she doing here? My nickname for this school is Grasshopper Land. Don't quote me on that, since one of the dean's life's work has been grasshoppers, which are fine. But like urban environment, like we've never had anyone teaching urban environment. Why would we want that in the School of Forestry and Environmental Studies? And of course, to me, urban environmental issues are some of the most compelling issues. And we've talked a lot about poverty, and we all know the problems arising from environmental degradation and poverty. But the scary thing about the urban environment is that the problems are even more severe stemming from affluence. And whether you look at water, sanitation, waste, energy, greenhouse gas implications, this is a field that is absolutely huge. Well, in the 5 years I've been there, I've sort of shaken things up a bit. I was appalled to find so many of my students had barely traveled. A number of my colleagues, same thing. So I started a program of field trips, initially privately funded. And in connection with the course on cities and sustainability, took students to Beijing, Delhi, Mexico City. I teach a transportation course, and as many people have said, some of the greatest transportation innovations in the world now are occurring in the South. So students went to Curitiba, Sao Paulo, Bogota, Shanghai, etc. And this really had a huge impact. I also taught a course at the School of Management where they decided to make urban field trips mandatory for all of their students. And miraculously, the university has come up with some funds now for some of these trips. This year, I'm taking my students to Johannesburg in the fall, and to Dubai. That's going to be, my architecture students will be entranced, my environmental students will be horrified, but it will be quite an interesting dynamic. Where's this all leading? Amazingly, even in a university with tremendous, tremendous institutional inertia, Yale University is actually contemplating setting up an urban studies program, which they have never had before. And there's a lot of huge, huge interest in this. And I'm going to be part of this, and I'm very, very excited about it. My graduate alma mater, Columbia University, within the last couple of years, has discovered urban, and, Jeffrey Sachs, et cetera, and the Earth Institute, they're doing a lot of work in the field. Rockefeller University has just climbed on board, and they are launching a big urban initiative, which is all very exciting. Why am I mentioning this? Well, it saddens me because with so many new actors in the field, one of the places that has had such preeminence in dealing with comparative urban studies is the Woodrow Wilson Center. And it's really a bittersweet experience to have the ending of this program. Why this has been so compelling for me, I often say to my students, people that really understand what's happening in urban areas on the ground are practitioners. In many cases, they don't write about it. And academics write their little articles. They maybe have worked their entire lives in one city, and they go there on their sabbatical every X years. And so the literature is out of sync with the knowledge of people who really work in the areas. And we haven't been able to bridge that. We need to bring, and there's definitely, I'm going to admit, prejudice in academia against, practitioners and these people. I mean, this isn't really serious work. And how do we bridge this? We have this institution here that has done such a superb job in doing this, the bringing together people who have serious academic backgrounds, but who also are practitioners. And I mean, the people I've met, Susan and Raquel and so many others, Richard, over the years, this is a very unique institution. And it saddens me deeply that so many new people are reinventing the wheel, et cetera, and getting into this game when this wonderful, wonderful program is coming to an end. I totally love what Blair had to say about what are the stories we have to tell. Well, some of the best stories I've ever heard came out of meetings here at the Wilson Center. And all I can say is, for me, this has been a wonderful journey. It's been wonderful to be involved with this network, and it deeply saddens me that it's coming to an end, and I hope that it will continue. And one of the things that, again, we talked about poverty issues. I don't think we talked enough about the incredible changes. I mean, the incredible changes. I mean, so much development in cities is now led by private developers. People working in municipalities have much less leverage over what's happening in a lot of cities now. And the world is really changing. I mean, I've been working in urban areas for, since the mid-'70s, and the changes are absolutely extraordinary. And it just is, it's a very sad occasion. Cities, as we know, are the largest entities created by man, and the challenges are getting more and more complex. And I hope there's some way we can figure keeping this wonderful, wonderful network that truly does bridge academia and people working in the field. Thanks.
Thank you, Ellen. I'm going to keep these remarks very brief, but at the beginning I didn't thank people who have been involved in this project, and I do owe a lot of people a lot of thanks, and I just very, very quickly, I don't want to abuse your time because those of you who are still here have been here a long time and we're well over our schedule. But I want to begin by thanking our colleagues at USAID, who have been wonderful partners, not just for this year and a half, but for the past 5 years. And we've had support from USAID's Urban Programs team of the Office of Poverty Reduction and the Bureau of Economic Growth, Agriculture and Trade, and previous incarnations of that group. And we've done a lot. We put out several books, a number of reports, shorter papers. We had international conferences with local partners in Bangkok, Dakar, New Delhi, Quito, Maputo, plus the past year and a half, the series here. And I think all of us who have worked with this program really owe a lot to the current and former staff, people like Ron Carlson, who's the Urban Programs team leader, Jessica Toludo, whom you heard from earlier, Mike Kasheshian, who's been our CTO on this project. And it's been a real pleasure to work with him. Previous people connected with the office, David Painter, Marcia Glenn, Alexi Pandohal, David Liebscomb, who in a way reinvented the program for us. So I wanted to thank them. I wanted to thank the advisory board members, two of whom you heard from today, Ellen and Richard, and the scholars and policymakers involved, people such as Raquel and Mohamed, previous CUSP staff at the Wilson Center, Joe Tolchin, my co-founder, and I'm going to have a word from Joe to read in a second, Diana Virat, who created this program when she was on the staff 5 years ago, Lisa Hanley, Karen Towers, Mejgan Masumi, and of course Allison Garland. So I wanted to thank them and my colleagues elsewhere in the Wilson Center. The Comparative Urban Studies project at the Wilson Center started in 1991. And it's been through several incarnations. It started because a number of us were challenged by the director at that time to get out of our boxes, was the way he kept putting it. And Joe Tolchin, who was the director of the Latin America program, and I, and a couple other people at the center started this series. And the first incarnation was produced a volume called Preparing for the Urban Future, Global Urban Future, that was the name of the title, yeah. And Mohamed was involved in that, Richard. When you go, I picked it up, and it's a really kind of strange collection of ideologies in the group because neocon favorite Robert Brugman is in there as well. So if you can imagine Brugman and Halfani in the same group, you can begin to get a sense of the dynamism that came out of that meeting. And then we had another section period where we were looking at the problems of the District of Columbia, and we're inviting international specialists to come look at the District of Columbia. And I remember Mohamed, one of my favorite moments, he showed up and he was talking about civil society, and as I recall, you had trouble finding civil society in the District of Columbia. He could find lists of civil society institutions in the yellow pages, but actually finding civil society was more difficult. And then, of course, the last 5 years, we've had the relationship with AID. Joe Tolchin wanted me, I won't bother reading all of his statement, but he, just these words from Joe. What CUSP has accomplished will not end today. Inevitably, the concern for cities and the multilateral agencies and AID and in the foundations will return. Then the human connections made by CUSP, the intellectual insights in its publications, the way of knowing about cities which our approaches opens to academics and policymakers alike will have great value. Certainly for me, Joe Tolchin, participating in this adventure has been enormously rewarding, and I look forward to hearing about activities in the future. We do have some activities scheduled. This Friday in the Senate, there will be a meeting on the African city, and Mohamed will be participating in that, and Billy Cobbett. If you're interested, we can get you information. On December 5th, a little bit slightly different kind of meeting, but with America's Wetlands, we're co-sponsoring a meeting on Louisiana's Comprehensive Master Plan for a Sustainable Coast. And you may ask, what does that have to do with urban? But obviously, it has a lot to do with New Orleans. And in early 2008, we hope to have some programming on community resilience, looking at how different communities around the world promote urban inclusion and define successful, healthy communities. So hopefully this is not the end, and even though it's the end of this particular phase, and I